At some
Hello.
point, at some point, I might move the screen because my back's been bothering me.
Okay,
I'm standing up right now. I might sit down a little
that's
later.
fine. That's
Okay.
fine. We're on air now. Welcome everybody to Unbiased America Live, episode 43, Dispelling the Lincoln Myths. We have with us Kevin Ryan, unfortunately, who seems to always follow me around. He is the purveyor of Unbiased America. He doesn't have his name tag up yet because I have to explain that to him before every show. That's what happens when you're 487 years old.
Keep it up, I'll
Um,
fire you.
we have a special guest. He is a senior legal scholar of the Legal Center at the Heritage Foundation. He's also the author of Manhunt, the 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer. You can see it here. This is the CD version, which is a bit archaic now. You can actually get a Kindle edition on Amazon. You can buy the book on Amazon as well. It's an excellent book. It was a bestseller. Also, he wrote a book, JFK, End of Days. The end of days, the assassination of JFK, and you also have a book series for young adults, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Every time I do an adult book, I do one for kids, for 9 to 14-year-olds, because they just don't get enough history in schools. So I try to give it to them through my books.
Well, that's also the case that most people don't get enough history anywhere, and
It's true.
and I think that's kind of the problem here with Lincoln. And whenever I engage with people of the Austro-libertarian bent, and I say Austro-libertarian because it's not generally, I would say, I distinguish between the Chicago School libertarians, those Friedmanites, and then the Austro-libertarians, the Rothbardians. And it's particularly the Rothbardians that are somewhat radical, specifically on history and anything that has to do with government. And, a couple of those are Tom DiLorenzo, who wrote a book on Lincoln, who is virulently anti-Lincoln, seems to cherry pick things, and we're going to clear some of those up, as well as Judge Napolitano, who I saw a snippet on YouTube, who is also contrarian on the Lincoln history. Started from the premise of Lincoln started this Civil War, and I wanted to enter Adam Friedman, who's been on the show before, starts off his chapter called States' Rights and Abolitionists with this. On March 24th, 1859, a leading statesman who would soon find himself fighting in the Civil War gave a speech entitled States' Rights. In it, he warned of federal usurpation of state sovereignty on the issue of slavery, and he urged states to exercise their powers of nullification and interposition. He told his listeners to stand firm against federal power, declaring, "Here is the battlefield, every man to his gun." And what he's saying here is that this wasn't Robert E. Lee saying this wasn't some Southern statesman declaring this. This was Carl Schurz, who is an abolitionist and a Northerner who went on to be a soldier in the Union Army, was just repeating, the same lines that abolitionists were for decades here, which was states' rights to interpose on laws they felt unjust that were enforcing slavery, and that was kind of this back and forth between the North and South. So it wasn't necessarily, or it wasn't at all, a states' rights issue for the South. It was the other way around. The South wanted the federal government to impose certain laws and restrictions on states' rights in order to enforce slavery. Where have I gone wrong there, James?
Well, the bottom line is federal power guaranteed the rights of the slave states to own their slaves. As Lincoln said when he was inaugurated president in March 1861, he gave a very endearing speech to the South to try to encourage them to not leave the Union. To back up a little, when Lincoln was elected in November 1860, the South was enraged because their Democratic candidate did not win, Stephen A. Douglas. The Democrats split, and John C. Breckinridge, the former vice president, was running for president. Lincoln was running. John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, was running. There were 4 candidates for president. And that meant that Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, although he got only 39.8% of the popular vote. So the South was outraged. Before Lincoln could even be inaugurated, before he did a thing, several southern states started to secede, beginning with South Carolina. They anticipated this parade of horribles that Lincoln was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he said on March 4th at his inauguration, and remember then the presidents were inaugurated later in March, not in January, Lincoln said, "I have no power to interfere with slavery."
Let me stop you there quickly. So what you're saying is that for decades, like I said when I started the show, that for decades the federal government ensured the survival of slavery in the South, and to a degree with the Fugitive Slave Act, specifically in 1850.
Yes, yes,
Right.
yes. Under federal
And
law, no president could interfere or stop slavery.
right, so the slavery interests, specifically in the Supreme Court with Robert Tawney, who had many, the Dred Scott case being one of them. It was a Southern sympathizing federal government, and when Lincoln's and the Republicans swept in, the South kind of feared that no longer did they have the federal government to impose to a degree their will on northern states.
Exactly. That's what the South was afraid of, increasing federal power.
Mm-hmm.
That's why there was such contention over whether slavery should be allowed in the new territories, because the South believed there was a northern conspiracy to limit their political power. So they didn't want two senators to come in from newly formed free states. They wanted senators to come in from newly formed slave states. So that's why there was great disagreement over whether slavery would be allowed in the new territories, which would ultimately become states and come into the Union as slave states. Every time a northern senator came into power, the South believed it was part of a conspiracy to deprive them of their rights.
Right. So I want to read, you said it was in his inaugural address, and what he said, that he had no intention at all to overturn or abolish slavery. He says, "It is scarcely questioned that this provision was intended by those who made it for the reclaiming of what we call fugitive slaves." He's discussing the Fugitive Slave Act.
Yes.
"And the intention of the lawgiver is the law. All members of Congress swear their support to the whole Constitution, to this provision as much as any other." So he understood that he had no constitutional power to abolish slavery in any shape or form, and his fidelity was to the Constitution, not just his repugnancy of slavery.
Exactly. Of course, Lincoln had a personal hatred of slavery. Lincoln once said, "If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong."
Mm-hmm.
Another time he said, "It's so funny that Southerners say how slavery is good. I've never met a man who volunteered to be a slave." Lincoln felt that slavery was a fundamental contradiction to the Declaration of Independence. To Lincoln, the Declaration was as important as the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And so he hated slavery throughout his life. He hated slavery when he came to the presidency, but he was not a radical abolitionist. And he realized the limitations on his office prevented him from, as president, making declarations or federal orders, executive orders, to stop slavery. He wanted it to end. Lincoln believed the best way to end slavery was to end it gradually, that the founders intended to have a gradual extinction. And that's why Lincoln wanted to prevent the spread of slavery to the new territories. He hoped that slavery would die a natural death over time. That was Lincoln's original hope.
And that happened in Brazil in 1888. It died out over time without a struggle. And Lincoln mentions several times that he had no power to do it. So I don't understand. Slavery wasn't in danger, any danger whatsoever, prior to 1863, obviously with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah.
So what's the South's beef here?
The mere fact of Lincoln's inauguration did not mean that anything was going to be done against slavery. The South overreacted, but for years they had built up this conspiracy theory, believing there was a northern conspiracy to deprive them of their political power. And they believed that one day the North would have overwhelming political power and then would strike against them. They also believed wrongly that Abraham Lincoln was the radical abolitionist that he was not.
Do you think the South concocted this conspiracy in order to coalesce support around slavery?
Well, I don't know about that, because Lincoln was also a believer in conspiracy theories.
Okay.
Lincoln gave a famous speech where he said that the Supreme Court under Tawney and Southern senators were in a pro-slavery conspiracy. In fact, Lincoln once said, "They may say there's no conspiracy, but when you come upon a building site and find the beams cut, perfectly cut to be joined together, with carpenter's tools, with plans, with designs, are you going to tell me that someone didn't plan this in advance?" So both sides, before the Civil War, tended to believe in conspiracy theories. Lincoln believed in his own, and the South certainly believed that the election of Lincoln was part of a northern conspiracy to deprive them of their power.
Right. Before we get into the Emancipation Proclamation and the suspending the writ of habeas corpus, it seems that if you defend Lincoln on some of these things, or you look at it within context instead of cherry pick, the common charge is this is the apotheosis of Lincoln. You worship at the temple of Lincoln. You're a Lincoln lover. I think DiLorenzo refers to it as the cult of Lincoln. It's funny coming from somebody who I would say there's the cult of Rothbard, a man who's don't get me started on Rothbard. But I mean, it seems that if you go through the facts and if you look at it within context, the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, there was a reason for that. Same with the Emancipation Proclamation, why he did it when he did, why he didn't do it right away, and they often use the Emancipation Proclamation as, oh, he didn't really ever want to abolish slavery. First, now it's he didn't want to actually do that. It was just he wanted to extend federal power. And Judge Napolitano makes this point that he wanted to start the war because he wanted to increase the scope and power of the federal government. But I think that's what Lincoln was lamenting before he even came into office, is that the federal government is encroaching on the rights of the sovereign states.
Well, remember this: Lincoln did not want to start the war. And that first inaugural address, he said, "You'll have no fight unless you yourselves are the aggressors." And Lincoln said, "Look back to the Revolution. Look to all the things that bind us. We must not be enemies. We must be friends." And he said repeatedly, "Unless you're the aggressors, we'll have no war." And remember, the South started seizing Union arsenals, post offices, forts, caches of arms, and Lincoln did not attack. The South was the first entity that fired the shot during the attack on Fort Sumter. Between November 1860, Lincoln's election, and the attack on Fort Sumter in April, the South had done a number of aggressive acts, but Lincoln did not retaliate with violence. Lincoln said, I'm going to bring food and supplies to forts, including Fort Sumter, but Lincoln did not order there to be any kind of attack or countermeasures against the South. Lincoln was hoping for a peaceful settlement. So if Lincoln wanted a war, he could have found many provocations before Fort Sumter to use violence against the South, but he didn't. He was hoping for a peaceful solution.
See, aren't you just a Lincoln lover, though? I mean, aren't you just, he's your god and he can't do anything wrong? I mean, they'll always say, isn't he a flawed man after this, as if that's some sort of a rebuttal. I mean,
Lincoln believed in this. He believed in the sanctity of free elections. He was elected President of the United States in 1860, and he did not believe that a disappointed party in the election could go and walk off. Yes, he did believe that the southern states should be compelled to remain in the Union. They couldn't just leave willy-nilly. He did believe that. He also believed certain things about freedom and liberty. You'll hear some people like DiLorenzo and others, and I'm familiar with these arguments. I used to work at the Cato Institute, the premier libertarian think tank. And sometimes people will cite the so-called Jeffersonian right of revolution as justifying the South secession. They didn't like the way the Union was operated. They felt oppressed. They had the right to secede. Jefferson said, if a government is oppressive, you should have a revolution. But Lincoln did not believe in, and I don't believe in, that you can justify a right of rebellion based upon the preservation of a slave empire.
Right. So what they're saying is we're going to use natural law to justify a rebellion, but we can't allow the slaves to use natural law to say that all men are created equal and endowed with certain rights. It's so contradictory. It's crazy.
That's why I argue that any argument that says the South had the right to rebel and leave the Union is based on the South denying the natural rights of the slaves.
And then use it.
How can you invoke the rights of man and liberty to be free when you own millions of slaves, and when you've owned slaves in your region of the country for over 250 years?
Right.
Remember, slavery began in America about 1620. So by the time of the Civil War, it was almost 250 years old. Many generations had been born into slavery. Millions of people had been the victims of slavery. So there's a great hypocrisy in arguing in favor of the Jeffersonian right of revolution to leave the Union based on a slave empire that denied liberty to millions of people.
Right, and it's funny. That's a good lead into the actual suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, because they want to use natural law when it benefits them, but they don't want to follow it all the way through. So what they give with their right hand, they take away with their left. The same goes for the Constitution. They're saying, oh, he suspended the writ. We'll get to the context of that in a second, but I just want people to understand what the Constitution says about the writ of habeas corpus. It says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety must require it. They didn't. I mean, this was debated vociferously at the Constitutional Convention. They understood that there may be rebellion. They understood what destroyed republics, and that was generally from within. And they understood that there may be a rebellion or invasion, that you would need to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Now, originally, what people will generally say is that, well, Robert Tawney ruled that, the suspension of the writ was in Article 1. So
I
therefore
just
only. Go ahead.
there. I got it back.
Oh, you got me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got it back.
Okay.
Here you go.
So people will say that the suspension of the writ was in Article 1, and Robert Tawney ruled on that. But if you look at it, and if you look at what the Committee on Style did, is that originally it was in Article 3. They just didn't really know where to put it. And here you have a Robert Tawney who already ruled on Dred Scott and ruled in other cases against the states and their interposition on constitutional law. He was a Southern sympathizer. He had a Southern sympathizing court that was imposing their will on the states. So obviously Tawney's going to rule against Lincoln. But Lincoln did call he did call in the Congress. I think it was about a year later or so, maybe a little bit less than that, to either to ratify it or rescind it.
Well, look at this. Even before then, look at the context Lincoln was in. He leaves Illinois in February 1861 to be inaugurated president. He received word that there are plots to assassinate him on the way to Washington. The Baltimore plot was real. Dozens of men had organized the plot to assassinate Lincoln, and he did have to come secretly through Baltimore. He received over 100 death threats in the mail that he'd be murdered before his inauguration. Someone sent him a jar of poisoned fruit. The capital city, Washington, D.C., was very much a Southern city. It was filled with Confederate spies and sympathizers, and it was almost undefended. When Lincoln arrived in Washington for his inauguration in late February and early March 1861, the city was almost undefended. There were hardly any federal troops in Washington. The Confederates could have come and seized the city. And so it was a time of incredible danger. So those were the circumstances. And Lincoln, as you say, under the Constitution, had the right to suspend the writ. But what's surprising to me is how moderate Lincoln was. There's all this talk about persecution and freedom of speech. A few newspapers were temporarily closed down. An editor was arrested briefly. One congressman who was fomenting rebellion was exiled to Canada. Lincoln could have arrested tens of thousands of people and held them throughout the war, but he didn't. And also this, Lincoln could have suspended the presidential election of November 1864, and he would have gotten away with it. He would have claimed it was an emergency war measure, there shouldn't be an election, he would remain in power anyway. Lincoln did not do that. All his measures were temporary. Lincoln did not engage in any of these measures to permanently set himself up as the king of America, the dictator of America, or the ruler of America. All these things were temporary. Lincoln once said, "Oh, do you want me to enforce all the laws to the letter except the one against rebellion, which will cause the Union to shatter?" Mm-hmm. The government is at stake. The very nation is at stake. I'm going to engage in extraordinary wartime measures temporarily during the war, and then when the war is over, those measures will come to an end. Also this, at the end of the war, he didn't want to have trials and executions of the secessionists and the Confederates leaders or the generals. Lincoln said, let everyone go home, let's have peace, I don't want there to be prosecutions, I don't want there to be recrimination. Lincoln was very much not the dictator when you compare all the things he could have done and could have gotten away with during the Civil War, but he chose not to.
Okay. Also, that's excellent context. I mean, if you were to watch, the anti-Lincoln crowd, they'd say, "Oh, he deported a guy and he locked up 350 journalists." And this is in Maryland, primarily, is where a lot of this occurred. And isn't the Northern Congress the command center for the war there? What if they had lost Maryland? Would they have been cut off from the White House and Congress?
Exactly. If the Confederates had seized Maryland, it would have been a disaster for the Union. Mm-hmm. And that was very much a real risk, especially early in the war. Washington could have been cut off. The rail line from Washington to Maryland was vital to get to Pennsylvania and New York City and other places. And so Lincoln was really in a city under siege and potential attack. And so we've got to remember, when people cite the example of Congressman Vallandigham, who was suppressed and then exiled, if we cite the case of Lincoln temporarily closing a newspaper, people forget to tell you it reopened again. They don't tell you that Lincoln did not arrest 20, 30, 40 congressmen. He had this one arrested temporarily. And many people were arrested with good reason. There were many spies in Washington, many Confederate agents, and there was great danger. And as Lincoln said, these are temporary, extraordinary plan. The same way with the draft.
So it's not like Barack Obama locking up half of the Republican Congress just on a whim.
No, no. The equivalent would be if a president today locked up 20 Republican congressmen. I mean, that's what Lincoln's critics say he was as bad as. What they don't tell you is how bad he could have gone, the things he could have done but chose not to do, and how moderate he was. Lincoln was sensitive to freedom of the press. He was sensitive to allowing dissent. He didn't arrest anyone. I should say he didn't arrest everyone who disagreed with him. But this myth has arisen among some of Lincoln's critics that he was a terrible president. If you want to see what a terrible president can do in wartime, look at the example of Woodrow Wilson. First, the racist president who kept blacks out of the army, who believed in segregation, who loved Birth of a Nation, the movie, and who during World War I suppressed civil liberties in a huge way. The prosecution of the so-called Reds in the 19 teens and through 1920 was a terrible usurpation of civil liberties. People were imprisoned for years for simply opposing U.S. fighting in World War I. They were arrested for opposing the draft.
And a lot of people will tether them together, saying that Woodrow Wilson went to war to grow the federal government, and Lincoln did the same thing and allied all context whatsoever. Whereas, Wilson expanded the powers of the presidency. A lot of these people say that, Lincoln was the first to expand these powers of the presidency beyond where they were and set precedent for later presidents like Woodrow Wilson.
Well, no. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt set their own precedents. They were expansionists. They expanded federal power. They expanded the size of the federal government in ways that Lincoln would never have dreamed.
Yeah, but just to interlude for a second, Lincoln's budget went right back down after the Civil War. Not that he was still around, but the point was it was not a permanent expansion of government under Lincoln.
Right.
We had the same amount of federal spending before the Civil War and after the Civil War, all the way up through, I think it was the 1890s or early 1900s before it started ballooning.
Yes, Lincoln is not the precursor for Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt. Lincoln's example was a modest example compared to those two. So we always have to remember them. Abraham Lincoln didn't intern 150,000 people of Japanese ancestry. Franklin Roosevelt did that. Abraham Lincoln didn't jail thousands of people who he suspected were communists. Woodrow Wilson did that. Abraham Lincoln didn't deport hundreds of immigrants for exercising their freedom of speech. Woodrow Wilson did that.
Mm-hmm. And another thing, what are the motivations of a lot of these people? Is it that they're just anti-government overall, and that they think that he was the precursor to this bloated government we have today, and that they kind of create this narrative? Because I mean, if you look into it, from what I heard, from what they're saying, you actually have to be like consciously either ignorant or you're doing this on purpose. It's one of the two.
Well, I can't explain. I really can't explain fully a lot of the anti-Lincoln sentiment.
I mean, DiLorenzo is an economist, so I don't know what he's doing looking at law and history. And I'm really always skeptical of economists that try to do constitutional law or natural law because they botch it 9 times out of 10. And Richard Posner is a good example of that. Well,
remember, the law and economics movement has made a very important contribution to the law. We wouldn't understand modern antitrust law.
Absolutely.
Scholars at University of Chicago and other places analyzing law and economics. I don't think it's because DiLorenzo is an economist. But obviously he has a strong anti-Lincoln bias. He's certainly he's written the most anti-Lincoln book of the modern era. And I think it must be a resentment against big government, a belief that Lincoln is at the core of it, at the blame of it. And also, some of the opponents of Lincoln believed the South had the right to secede. They believed that Lincoln oppressed the rights of the South, and they're unwilling to admit that the greatest oppressors of the rights was the Southern slave empire that held millions of people in bondage for 250 years. Mm-hmm. And as Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong.
And I'm sorry, just going to interject. It's funny that you mentioned that because there was more murmurings of Northern secession because they felt like the imposition was on them. That the Fugitive Slave Act, and let me just read to you how horrible that was, and they found it really appalling, and so did I. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 called for the appointment of federal commissioners in every state with authority to issue and execute warrants for the capture of runaway slaves. The act empowered the commissioners to command all citizens in the area to join a posse comitatus, which is in English a lynch mob. Those who refused to join the posse faced fines or even jail time. Captured blacks were denied the benefit of jury trials. Commissioners and judges were ordered to try any fugitive slave case in a summary manner. Commissioners were paid $10 if they ruled in favor of the slave owner, but only $5 if they ruled against him. All in all, it was one of the most brutal laws of the antebellum period, enacted by the federal government at the behest of slave states to quash the rights of free states. So the North was really had more murmurings of secession than the South at that time.
Yes, in fact, I've seen heartbreaking posters that were published at the time in the 1840s, 50s, and early 60s in Boston and other northern cities. And these posters were placed in public places. And it warned all free blacks of the city to go into hiding because the slave catchers were in town.
Wow.
And these slave catchers were pretty indiscriminate about who they captured and tried to bring back south to slavery. They wouldn't hesitate to capture a free man and claim that he was an escaped slave and bring him back to the South. And so northern communities rooted for these escaped slaves, tried to help them, notified the populace when slave hunters were in town because they wanted to resist the recapture of slaves or totally free people who were never slaves under the Fugitive Slave Act. Many northern cities and states were outraged that slave hunters could come into their territory and try to seize escaped slaves.
And that's interesting too, and I want people to know that the abolition movement wasn't new. Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush had in 1774, I think it was, they had started an abolition movement in the North. Alexander Hamilton did the same in New York. So this wasn't any sort of like, oh, this is a new abolition movement. This had been going on since the framing. You had the southern states at the time of the ratification wanted to get as much in the Constitution as the North would allow to ensure slavery. The North was the complete opposite, going to the extent of never using the term slave or slave or mention anybody's skin color or so on or so forth.
But
go ahead.
Remember this, though. Abolitionism was considered quite eccentric and odd in the 1830s, the 1840s, even the 1850s. Even Northerners, some of them felt that the abolitionist movement was going to destroy the Union, and they were afraid of it. And so, in polite society, to be an abolitionist was considered to be a little out there, a little radical, and dangerous. In fact, one of William Lloyd Garrison's statements was, "I have mountains of ice around me to melt." And that's because a friend of his said, "Well, moderate yourself, young man. Don't be so wild and so incendiary." And he said, "I have to be all on fire. I have mountains around me to melt." And remember this, too. Much of Northern society, though it was anti-slavery, was anti-black, and it was racist. And it did not want those free blacks to come north. In fact, some of the very abolitionists were also members of the Colonization Society who, once they freed slaves, wanted to ship them off out of America. Even in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln had a black delegation visit him at the White House. And he said to this delegation, "Look, there are too many problems between our races. We'll never get along. Right. There's too much bad blood. Look into colonization." And this delegation of black citizens was outraged. Many of them said, "What do we know about Africa? We're not African, we're American. Maybe our ancestors came from Africa, but we have nothing to do with Africa. We're here, and we're going to stay." And so we can't forget how much racism there was in Northern society. And Northern laborers did not want blacks to come north to compete with them for jobs and wages. Northern leaders, many of whom were racist, didn't want the freed slaves coming north. So they may have been abolitionists, but the last thing many of them wanted was to see all the freed slaves move up north.
Right, and the all-out war in New York City with the Irish, essentially lynching blacks and anyone who would support them. At the time, the draft riots was another thing that you saw in the North that
Yes.
clearly, yeah, you know, I mean,
Remember this in 1863 in New York City, as you say, when there were riots protesting the draft. Wild mobs lynched blacks from trees and street posts in New York. They even attacked and destroyed in New York City, in Manhattan. They even destroyed and attacked a black orphanage of helpless children.
It's terrible. And like you said, a part of the reason was that they feared rebellion if there was abolition tomorrow. That if you abolish slavery, that the slaves, like they did in Haiti in the early 1800s, would rebel, and you would have another civil war and perhaps the end of the Union or the nation as a whole. Correct?
Yes, and remember New York City was very much anti-union. A lot of people in New York sympathized with the South. They favored it. They favored Southern victory or letting the South go. In fact, Walt Whitman, who was one of the greatest observers and writers about the Civil War, he was a nurse at Union hospitals. He wrote extensively about the war. He observed a lot of suffering, and he got to know the soldiers, and he empathized with them and wrote poems about them. Walt Whitman said that New York City was a place of thuggery and gangrened and poison. And he knew how disloyal and how anti-black New York City was during the Civil War.
Kevin, I know you have a ton of questions. Fire away.
sure. Well, just two observations first. You ask, where does this anti-Lincoln sentiment come from? I've noticed it in two places. One is the obvious place, the South. Lost the war, and there's always been resentment in the South for the leadership of the North, and that continues to this day. You see a lot of these arguments over the Confederate flag and so forth. It's still to this day is a point of contention, and I think Lincoln gets a lot of blame for it. But even more recent than that, I'd say you could look at what happened under Barack Obama when you had almost a neo-secessionist movement, which crops up once in a while. But I think this one really caught some momentum, at least among the people who were anti-Barack Obama. And I think when they started thinking to themselves, the reason we can't secede from this union, which we no longer believe represents us, is because of what Lincoln committed during the Civil War. And I think you have a new wave of anti-Lincoln sentiment, and I see it every day from people that post, especially sort of the libertarians and the people who are revisionist in their history and so forth. But I also get a lot of stuff thrown my way in terms of quotes and in terms of things that Lincoln did that people question what you're saying about whether he's anti-slavery or not. I'm just going to throw a couple at you, sort of play devil's advocate for a second here.
And I bet they're going to come from the 1858 campaign with Stephen Douglas.
Exactly.
Well, there's the letter to Horace Greeley.
Yes.
Yeah.
My paramount object in the struggle to save the Union is not to either save or destroy slavery. It's if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps the Union.
But then remember, the end of that letter says, "But I do not modify my long expressed personal wish that all men be free." You're right. Lincoln did write that letter. Well, he believed that. As Lincoln said in his 1861 inaugural address, "I have no power to end slavery." And so he believed in 1863, until he did the Emancipation Proclamation, that his paramount objective was to save the Union, bring the Southern states back into the Union, and have as little a loss of life as possible. And then, of course, if you've got them, you should read them so people hear them. Lincoln said different things about slavery and equality, depending on which part of Illinois he was in during his famous 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas. The farther Lincoln was deep into southern Illinois, which was pro-Southern, Lincoln's statements about race and equality were more equivocal. When he got north to Chicago and other communities near there, he was more vivid about equal rights and equality. But nowhere during his debates with Douglas did he ever adopt a pro-slavery point of view. He shaded, as a politician would, he shaded his statements about equality. In one town, he said, "Well, just because I would want to have a black woman be free doesn't mean I would want her as a wife." which addressed northern obsession with mixture of the races. But when he got in more northern territory in Illinois, he said all men must be free, and slavery is a great evil. So Lincoln was consistent about one thing. He never favored slavery. He never wanted to continue slavery. He never wanted to prolong it. His wish always was that it end, and it was wrong, and it was evil.
Are you saying that Lincoln actually was a politician?
Yeah. Yes. Well, here's the funny thing. Lincoln's not a saint. He wouldn't want us to think of himself as a saint. Saints don't get to be president. I'll give you one of my favorite examples of that. When Lincoln was rumored to be a strong possible candidate for the Republican nomination in the spring of 1860, he had his convention managers go to the convention in Springfield in May 1860. Now, in those days, presidential candidates did not go to the convention in person. And they didn't even campaign nationwide in person. We had a much more literate electorate then. People actually voted for the president based on his papers, his speeches, his writings, his letters, his themes. So Lincoln told his campaign managers, led by Judge David Davis of Illinois, who Lincoln would later appoint to the U.S. Supreme Court, Lincoln told them, don't make any promises, don't do any obligations, try to get me the nomination. Well, the first thing his managers did is they counterfeited tickets to gain entry to the convention hall. And so Lincoln's supporters filled all the seats with false passes before the delegates of Governor Seward of New York, the favored nominee, could even enter the hall. Then Lincoln's managers made promise after promise. If you support Lincoln, you can be the Secretary of the Navy. If you support Lincoln, you can be head of the Treasury Department. If you support Lincoln, you'll be the Postmaster General. And then Lincoln's guys came back to him after they won the nomination for him, and they said, here's the bill, here's what we owe. And Lincoln said, pay it in full, give them all those jobs. Now, that surprises some people who think of Lincoln as a saint, but Lincoln was a politician. He was a practical politician with great ideals.
Interesting. And I want to go back really quickly to Kevin's point that he wanted to maintain the Union, which is absolutely true. And
getting some static on your mic there.
Can you hear me? Is it still bad?
Yeah, maybe fiddle with your
all right,
connection or something.
Go ahead, ask another question while I do that.
Okay. Well, I was just going to point out another quote that I think is used almost ironically, because it almost in a way goes against what the people using this quote use it to claim. He says, I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. Oh, sorry, got the wrong quotes for you. Actually, I'll keep going on that quote, but he says, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race which I belong to having the superior position. Not what I was talking about, but also an interesting quote in that it seems to, if it is part of the Douglas debates, it seems to point out that Lincoln does in fact, at least in that speech, favor white superiority.
Well, he wanted the audience to believe in that particular town that he'd be willing to accept white superiority as a price of freedom to the slaves. Yes, but Lincoln, at his core, Lincoln believed this. He believed that every man, black or white, had the right to the earnings of the sweat of his brow. He believed that that was the great evil of slavery, that it deprived man of the freedom to work, to be paid, to advance himself. And Lincoln believed in that equal right above all. He said if that wasn't true for the slaves, it was a corruption and perversion of the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln always believed that. And also, at the end of the war, a few days before he was assassinated, Lincoln talked about giving blacks the right to vote. And of course, he passed the 13th Amendment, and then the 14th and 15th Amendment were passed, ending slavery, giving equal rights under the law to the freed slaves. So Lincoln believed that the freed slaves should enjoy absolutely equal treatment under the law. They should enjoy the right to vote. They should enjoy all the rights of citizenship. Lincoln did believe all those things.
How about his treatment of Native Americans? I mean, another thing that's always thrown at me is the fact that he was the one who ordered the largest mass execution of, it was the Indian Raiders in Mankato, Minnesota. December
Yes,
26, 1862, still the largest mass execution on U.S.
yes,
soil.
yes. That was the famous or infamous Sioux uprising in
Right.
Minnesota. What happened was provoked by corrupt and incompetent white Indian agents. The Sioux rose up, and they went from community to community and murdered a number of whites in their cabins around their farms. So what happened was hundreds of Native Americans were arrested, and approximately 200 were sentenced to death. Lincoln said, I'm not going to allow this to happen. I want to see the case files. I want to review this myself. So Lincoln commuted and spared from execution approximately 150 of the Native Americans. I don't have it in front of me. Lincoln could have let 200 be hanged, but he didn't. He reviewed their cases. And I don't know that case well enough to know what the evidence against each person was. But some of them had killed a number of men, women, and children. Some of them were executed. But again, that shows Lincoln's moderation. He could have just said, hang them all, don't bother me. He said, instead, I'm going to look at these cases because I don't want there to be unfairness or injustice. So that's a little more detail about that Sioux uprising of 1862. Again, I'm not an expert on it, so I can't tell you exactly how many Lincoln freed or the exact number that were hanged. I can say I think about 40 were hanged and about 150 were freed or pardoned by Lincoln. But that's what I do know about that.
Which is interesting because it's actually used as an example of Lincoln's cruelty. And so I think it speaks more to the type of debate we're facing in America today, where you have, each side has blinders on to half the truth and half the story, and they come up with their own narrative to support what they want to believe. And I think that goes all the way through everything we've spoken about today in terms of whether you're pro or anti-Lincoln. There's a way that you can look at each one of these cases to come up with your narrative that supports your narrative, so to the evidence that supports your narrative.
Right. Well, that makes it more difficult when people don't reveal the full facts.
Right.
It makes it easier to obscure the truth. If I could give one little example from current times relating to the Supreme Court nomination. Now, it's interesting that at the moment it's the Republicans who have control over the Senate. And so Democrats who do not have control over the Senate are complaining that Republicans are unfairly and even in an evil way obstructing the nomination. I just read a comment today from Senator Leahy that said he was most fair when he was running the Judiciary Committee, and he didn't do things like this. But he prevented over 25 of President Bush's nominees to the federal courts from ever getting a hearing. And so what's fascinating to me during this dispute about the Supreme Court nomination is we're not getting the full facts. Until an enterprising reporter found Vice President Biden's statements about why Supreme Court nominees should be blocked under a Republican administration, people didn't even realize the facts of what was happening. I don't mention this to get into all the details and arguments pro and con about the stopping of the Supreme Court nomination. I'm just saying it's easier to complicate things. It's easier to make an argument, a partisan argument, if you're not willing to admit all of the basic facts. And I think this case of Lincoln and the execution of the Indians is a good example. Lincoln didn't go out and say, kill as many Indians as you can find. Lincoln said, you sentenced too many to death. I'm suspicious that they all deserve that penalty. Let me personally review their cases. And he ended up preventing 3/4 of the ones sentenced to death from being hanged.
Yeah, Will and I talked about it earlier too, about how you also have to keep in everything in context of the day. You can't, you can't look back and say, okay, what he did was horrific, because, maybe it would have been horrific, some things that occurred in the 1860s versus what would have happened today. You really have to keep in mind the day in which things occurred, the context in which it occurred, and I don't see that anymore. I see a lot of revisionist history going on. And it's sad, because here we are defending somebody who not that long ago was considered one of the greatest presidents in American history, and now we're defending. We're being told that he's the worst president in American history.
Well, as you pointed out earlier, I think some of this might come from whether we call it the myth of the lost cause or the ideology of the Old South. Now, let me begin by saying we should remember this. We should remember, though slavery was wrong, though it was evil, though it had to be ended, The South did suffer incredibly under the Civil War. Many parts of the South did not recover for 100 years, just as the equal rights of black Americans were not recognized a century after the Civil War. It took Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and other things since then to fulfill those rights. There was a terrible legacy for 100 years after the Civil War. It was really a twofold legacy. The South was laid waste, and black Americans were not really free the way Lincoln wanted them to be. So part of this resentment of Lincoln, I think, does come from what you say about the myth of the lost cause, the South losing the Civil War, viewing Lincoln as the author of all their ills. But I still say, in the end, it was not Lincoln who started the Civil War. The South fired the first shot. Lincoln then called the troops forward. The South built an army. The South had to aggressively do something to secede from the Union. They fired on Fort Sumter. They raised an army. They put the army in the field. And so there is tremendous resentment in the South. I have met a family in Lynchburg, Virginia, that began celebrating their family cotillion on April 15th, 1866. Why that date? Because they wanted to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And quietly, in secret, they today, to this day, don't commemorate. They celebrate the death of Abraham Lincoln. Now, 151 years ago, next week, on April 14th, he was shot. He died on the 15th. And so throughout the South, there is still some resentment about the loss of the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln.
I just want to let you know, I think, Will, are you having some problems with your mic? Yeah, his mic isn't working. So I have a couple more things I want to add, and then we'll wrap it up. I also know you did some books on JFK.
Yes.
And I was just interested to get your quick answer to the question everyone always asks: was he the victim of a conspiracy?
Well, if you thought you get a lot of reaction to saying Lincoln is a hero or Lincoln is good, you're going to get a lot more protests when you hear what I say about the Kennedy assassination. I did do two books. I did one book called End of Days, The Assassination of John F. Kennedy for Adults, and I did another book called The President Has Been Shot, The Assassination of John F. Kennedy for 9 to 14-year-olds. Whenever I do an adult book, I always do a young adult book because I think kids don't get enough history, and I'm trying to give it to them in my books. I also did one called Chasing Lincoln's Killer, a big best-selling book for kids on the Lincoln assassination, because kids, it's a myth that kids are bored by history. They just haven't been taught it right. They haven't been exposed to it in the right way, in an exciting manner. My conclusion is this, in a nutshell. On November 22nd, 1963, an ex-U.S. Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald, who defected to the Soviet Union and who 6 months earlier tried to murder a U.S. Army general in Dallas, Texas with a sniper attack, went to the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository and shot John F. Kennedy. And there's overwhelming evidence that supports that. I can't get it into detail now, so I try to give a lot of it in my book. The best book refuting the conspiracy theories is the great Vincent Bugliosi's Reclaiming History. Vince was the great prosecutor who prosecuted Charles Manson and wrote that best-selling book, Helter Skelter, one of the most frightening books of the 20th century. Issue by issue, he refutes the conspiracy theories. Let me give one example. It's one of my favorites. We all know that Lee Harvey Oswald went to work that morning driving in a car with a friend of his who worked at the book depository. Oswald walked over to his house. The man's sister watched Oswald go to the car and lay a package wrapped in brown paper in the back seat. The driver said, "Lee, what's in the bag?" He said, "Oh, curtain rods." Now, Oswald's rooming house had blinds, it had curtains. He didn't need curtain rods. He then goes to work. Then, after Kennedy's shot, the entire book depository is searched massively by the Secret Service, the Dallas Police, and the FBI. Here's an interesting question. Where were the curtain rods? If Oswald was innocent and telling the truth, no curtain rods were ever found in the Texas School Depository. All that was found was the rifle and the paper bag that Oswald used to bring the rifle to work that day, claiming the rifle was curtain rods. That's one of about 100 persuasive pieces of evidence of how it was Oswald. And don't forget this. Less than an hour after Oswald murdered the president, he murdered a Dallas policeman, shooting him 4 times. The coup de grace, the poor officer's lying on the ground, Oswald shoots him in the head and says either, "Poor dumb cop," "Poor damn cop." The police arrest Oswald in a movie theater, and he says, "All right, this is it," and he tries to pull his pistol and shoot them. Then Oswald is under arrest. He gives these hallway press conferences, and a reporter says, "Did you shoot the president?" Now, if you or I were arrested for something like that, wouldn't we say, "I'm innocent, get me out of here, that's a lie"? Oswald calmly says, "No, I haven't been charged with that crime. I don't know why I'm here. I only know that I've been accused of shooting a policeman." There are 90 other pieces of obvious compelling evidence that point to Lee Harvey Oswald firing that rifle from the Texas School Book Depository.
But that's no fun. I mean, that's not going to sell as many tickets as the movie JFK, and that's not going to let people have their own visions and fantasies about, you know. I mean, there's a huge, and this goes towards what we talked about with Lincoln too. There's a huge anti-government and anti-establishment presence in America right now that will try to tie everything that they can to nefarious means and to evil motivations and intents. And I think that's what we see when we talk about Lincoln, as well as the assassination and just about anything else. And I'm not a fan of Obama's, but a lot of the same thing happens when people talk about the government these days. But, you know, anyways, I think we really want to take a chance here and just thank you very much for coming on the show.
I call that the great singularity.
Isn't it?
There are many people who believe that it was the same conspiracy who killed John Kennedy, who killed Martin Luther King, who killed Robert Kennedy, and who perpetrated 9/11. They believe that there's a shadow government, and they have the privilege of knowing the secrets of the shadow government. The rest of us don't see it. The rest of us are supposed to be ignorant of it, but they believe they possess special knowledge of the secret master conspiracy that has run American life for the last 50 years or more.
And we have a lot of those people visiting our site and our pages every day. And it's frustrating, but it's also in some ways fun to poke holes in what are obviously very fanciful theories and so forth. But listen, we want to thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Again, because we could have had you on for 2 hours. I'm sorry that Will is saying something. What's he saying there? Oh, nobody can read your sign, Will. Learn how to write, buddy. Anyways, thank you so much, James Swanson, for coming on the show, and let's have you on again sometime, okay?
Great, thank you.
All right.